It's tremendously great to be here, and as you can tell from the news, especially since the beginning of the year in Northern Africa, we have a major opportunity in the world to redefine the relationship with Islam. But what direction should we go? How should we think about the relationship, especially of the United States and the West, to Islam in the world? Well, we've been doing some research at the University of Chicago that I think will help put some of these questions into better context. I study suicide terrorism. Why suicide terrorism? Suicide terrorism is the lung cancer of terrorism. The average suicide attack kills 12 times as many compared to the average ordinary terrorist attack. Without the element of suicide, the 9/11 hijackers could never have killed 3,000 people. How do we know that? In 1993, there was an ordinary terrorist attack against the very same World Trade Center where terrorists put a truck bomb under in a garage, tried to fell one of the towers, killed 6 people. Well, we certainly didn't turn our country upside down over that terrorist attack in 1993. We didn't turn our foreign policy upside down over that ordinary terrorist attack. In other words, the threat, the real problem that we face is not just simply terrorism, but specifically suicide terrorism. And unless we understand better the root cause of suicide terrorism, we're likely not to get the problem right. Now, for a number of years, I've been doing research on suicide terrorism. I'm the person that published the first complete database of all suicide terrorist attacks around the world. I did this as part of an academic article in 2003. When I published that database, I knew then that no academic, no think tank had such a database. What I didn't know is that no government had such a database either. I was quickly contacted by our Department of Defense. And I'm going to emphasize this again and again because the Department of Defense, yes, the Donald Rumsfeld Department of Defense, was actually one of the big funders of this study that you're about to see. And that's important because you're going to see that this runs very counter to the policies of the Bush administration. And nonetheless, they were one of the major funders from the beginning of this study. So too has been the Navy. So too has been foundations such as the Carnegie Corporation in New York, also Argonne National Laboratories, and the University of Chicago itself. Because what this generous funding has made it possible for me to do is to become, as you'll see, the leader of a project called the Chicago Project on Security and Terrorism, which collects information about suicide attacks all around the world. But the way to think about it is what we do is collect information the way a medical researcher would collect information on lung cancer. We treat suicide terrorism just like lung cancer. And we want to know who gets it and who doesn't get it to better understand the root causes of the problem. We're not starting from Republican principles or Democratic principles. We're not starting from Muslim principles or Christian principles. We're just looking at data. That's what we are doing, just looking at data to find out who gets it and who doesn't get it.
Where are the Tibetan Buddhist suicide bombers? If you think for a moment that the kind of violence we see in the Muslim world is born of the Israeli occupation and our misadventures in Iraq, we should see Tibetan Buddhist suicide bombers. The Tibetans have suffered an occupation every bit as brutal and far more cynical than any that we or the British or the Israelis have imposed upon the Muslim world. Something like 1 million, 1.2 million Tibetans have died since the Chinese occupation. Where are the throngs of Tibetans in the streets calling for the deaths of Chinese non-combatants? Where are the Tibetans blowing themselves up on Chinese buses, at weddings, in crowds of children, in front of the offices of the Red Cross and the UN? It's not happening. It's not likely to happen. It's not that you could not possibly form a death cult out of the principles of Tibetan Buddhism. In fact, to some degree, Zen Buddhism informed the worldview of the kamikaze pilots during World War II. But you would have to work very hard to bend the core principles of Buddhism into this kind of orgy of violence. You don't have to work so hard as a Muslim.
Now, what does the database show? I want to talk to you about the database in two parts. First, the world of suicide terrorism around the world from 1980 to 2003. Think about that as suicide terrorism before the Iraq War, and then from 2004 on. Think about that as the world of suicide terrorism after the Iraq War. Well, from 1980 to 2003, there were 343 completed suicide terrorist attacks defined in the classic sense you would expect when I use that term of an individual killing himself, or herself on a mission to kill others. That's what we're tracking. That's classic definition. The world leader during this period is not, and I want to score, not an Islamic group. They're the Tamil Tigers in Sri Lanka, a Marxist group, a secular group, a Hindu group. The Tamils in Sri Lanka did more suicide attacks than Hamas or Islamic Jihad. Further, at least a third of all Muslim suicide attacks are by purely secular groups, such as the PKK in Turkey, which is another Marxist, read anti-religious suicide terrorist group. Notice over 50% are not associated with Islamic fundamentalism. Now think about that for a moment. What do most people think is driving suicide terrorism? Religion. Any older religion? No. Islamic fundamentalism. It doesn't hold up, ladies and gentlemen. It simply doesn't hold up. The facts don't fit.
We are at war, to digress briefly into our current situation. We are at war with Islamic fundamentalism. Not merely Al-Qaeda, not extremist Islam. The mainstream doctrine of Islam contains this notion of martyrdom and jihad. It contains this imperative to convert, subjugate, or kill infidels. Anyone who says it doesn't has not read the Quran, has not read the Hadith, or is lying about them. It is taboo to notice this.
What most people want to know about is Al-Qaeda. This research was the first to collect the complete set of the 71 individuals who actually killed themselves to carry out attacks for Osama. Of those 71, we know the names, nationality, and other socioeconomic data of 67. Not quite all, but almost all. And the largest number, 34, come from Saudi Arabia, the large majority from the Arabian Peninsula, where the United States first began to station combat forces in 1990. It's important to underscore, even to an educated audience, that 1990 was the watershed year in our military deployment to the Arabian Peninsula. Yes, before 1990, the United States had a few hundred advisors there, mostly Marines with sidearms standing guard in front of an embassy, but no tanks, no fighter aircraft, no armor units, going all the way back to World War II. We put those forces in to kick Saddam out of Kuwait. We kicked him out of Kuwait in March 91 and never left. From that day on, March 91 on, we kept between 12 and 30,000 combat soldiers stationed on the Arabian Peninsula. And the Al-Qaeda attacks start 5 years later in 1995. Moreover, notice where the Al-Qaeda suicide attackers are not coming from. Iran. Surely an Islamic fundamentalist population, 3 times the population size of Saudi Arabia. No Al-Qaeda suicide attackers. Sudan. Sudan is an Islamic fundamentalist country, about the same population size as Saudi Arabia, and with a brand of Islamic fundamentalism so congenial to Osama, he chose to live there for 3 years in the 1990s. No Al-Qaeda suicide attackers. Bangladesh, one of the largest Islamic fundamentalist populations on the planet, over 110 million people, and no Al-Qaeda suicide attackers. just to come, if this was about Islamic fundamentalism, we would see, ladies and gentlemen, a very different pattern in who was producing the suicide terrorists.
So the problem with religious moderation, another problem, is that moderates are blinded by their own moderation. A moderate doesn't know what it's like to be certain of paradise. A moderate doesn't know what it's like to be certain of God, to be certain that the book he keeps by his bedside is the perfect word of the creator of the universe. And so when the moderate sees the jihadist in the video camera saying things like, "We love death more than the infidel loves life," and then he blows himself up, it's the moderate who's left wondering, well, that couldn't be faith. I mean, that's propaganda, I don't know what that was, but that's not religion. So it is really the discourse of religious moderation that keeps convincing us that religion is not the problem, that this violence would happen anyway, that these 19 guys would have killed a lot of people anyway. There's no evidence for that.
So far, we've just talked about the data. But before I just keep talking more about data, I want to let you listen to the Al-Qaeda suicide attackers themselves.
It's crucial for Muslims to keep in mind that the Americans, the British, and the other members of the coalition of terror have intentionally targeted Muslim civilians and civilian targets, both before as well as after September 11th, in both the first and second Iraq wars, as well as in their forays into Somalia and the Sudan and Afghanistan, just to give you a few examples. And they've done this with the support and backing of their populations and electorates. I mean, even if there have been some feeble protests scattered here and there in the West, chiefly against the latest war in Iraq, all the same, the governments which started these wars have been re-elected by a majority of the popular vote. In their aggression against Afghanistan, which for Westerners and their mercenary sympathizers is the least controversial of Bush and Blair's terrorist wars, they have targeted civilians for assassination and kidnapping. They kidnapped any non-Afghans they found and shipped them off to Guantanamo or worse. Many were handed over to the American and British-backed despotic regimes of the Islamic world to be brutally interrogated, and with the blessing and support of that notorious Afghan killer Hamid Karzai, they've murdered thousands of Afghan civilians as they slept in their beds, traveled on the roads, attended weddings, and prayed at the mosques. I know they've killed and maimed civilians in their strikes because I've seen it with my own eyes. My brothers have seen it. I've carried the victims in my arms. Women, children, toddlers, babies in their mother's wombs. You name it, they've probably bombed it. I could go on, and that's just Afghanistan. We haven't talked about American and British atrocities in the two Iraq wars. Let's take a look at the latest to be revealed. In Mahmoudiyah, 5 American soldiers gang rape an Iraqi woman, and then to hide the evidence, murder her and 3 members of her family and burn her body. And then, when our Mujahideen take revenge on the unit which committed this outrage and capture and execute 2 of its members, they're called terrorists, and Muslims are supposed to disown them or face the consequences. And I'm not saying that we should go and slaughter their women and children one by one like they did ours at Haditha and Ishaqi and Mahmoudiyah and God knows where else, even if some of our legal experts have permitted that. And even if it's hard to imagine that any compassionate person could see pictures, just pictures of what the Crusaders did to those children and not want to go on a shooting spree at the Marines housing facilities at Camp Pendleton. But what I am saying is that when we bomb their cities and civilians like they bomb ours, or destroy their infrastructure and means of transportation like they destroy ours, or kidnap their non-combatants like they kidnap ours, no sane Muslim should shed tears for them. And they should blame no one but themselves, because they're the ones who started this dirty war, and they're the ones who will end it, by ending their aggression against Islam and Muslims, by pulling out of our region, and by keeping their hands out of our affairs. And until and unless they do that, Neither Forest Gate-style police raids, nor Belmarsh or Guantanamo prison cells, nor the Mosques and Imams Advisory Council will be able to prevent the Muslims from exacting revenge on behalf of their persecuted brothers and sisters.
From beginning to end, this is a call to respond to the plight of a kindred population under a foreign occupation. It's terribly important to see how Al-Qaeda thinks it can best recruit if we're going to develop policies to stop that process.
If you doubt this, if you think, I'm sure there are people in this room who are still thinking, no, it can't be religion. This is lack of economic opportunity. It's lack of educational opportunity in the Muslim world. Just contemplate for a moment the biographies of the 19 men who woke up on September 11th, 2001 and decided to slit the throats of stewardesses and fly planes into buildings. Okay, these guys were college educated to a man. Many of them had PhDs. Many of them had been educated in the West. They were middle class or better. I don't know how many architects and engineers need to hit the wall at 400 miles an hour for us to get it into our heads that this is not merely a problem of education or economics. These were not guys who had spent a lot of time agitating about regime change in the Middle East. These were guys who spent an inordinate amount of time at their local mosque in Hamburg talking about the pleasures that await martyrs in paradise and demonizing infidel culture.
Let's get Dr. Pape's perspective on that then.
Yes, well, first of all, I have a different view about poverty. I'm very skeptical that poverty is actually the root cause of suicide terrorism. I have no doubt that in Afghanistan, many of the suicide attackers are poor. That's because many of the Afghan society has been poor for a long period of time. But suicide terrorism in Afghanistan has not been going on for decades and decades and decades. It's specifically been going on since 2001. That is, since the United States toppled the Taliban. Before that point, there was never a suicide attack in Afghanistan's history. And in fact, until the United States deployed its army in large numbers, starting in 2006, to the Pashtun homelands in the south and the east of the country, even after we toppled the Taliban, for the first few years, suicide terrorism was relatively minor, just have a handful of attacks a year. Since 2006, we've had over 400 suicide attacks in Afghanistan. They are perpetrated 90% by Afghan nationals. This is not a global jihad swirling around the world. It's coming out of mostly Afghan nationals. And it's true, many of them are poor, but that's because 72% of Afghanistan is illiterate. And so if you're going to have a local opposition to America's military presence in the Pashtun homeland, they would have to be poor.
So the problem we have is that we desperately want to believe that everyone views the world the same way, and if we could just moderate our behavior, all of our enemies would disappear. It'd be so much easier to imagine that we made our enemies. There's no evidence for that, no credible evidence for that. And so whenever I hear someone on the left, and again, I am on the left on every relevant issue. I think homosexuals should be free to marry. I think taxes should go up on the wealthy. I think the war on drugs should be declared over. I am left. Okay, but when I hear people on the left talk about Osama bin Laden as though he were the Reverend Jim Jones of the Muslim world, I mean, that is a phantasmagorical degree of denial of the obvious. Osama bin Laden could be doing anything else he wants with his life. And the problem we face vis-a-vis Islam is that the version of Islam that he's teaching is really faithful to the Quran and the Hadith. I mean, you have to split hairs to see what he is distorting, if anything. Now, if he were Amish or a Jain or even a Buddhist, it would be absolutely obvious what he's distorting. I mean, you just couldn't make sense of his behavior in terms of his faith.
What made Osama bin Laden popular, what made him famous, was not being an Islamic radical. There are dozens and hundreds of Islamic radicals. What made him famous was his public vigorous opposition to the deployment of tens of thousands of American ground forces in Saudi Arabia and other countries on the Arabian Peninsula in the 1990s. That became the rallying cry that brought dozens and then hundreds to support Al-Qaeda, and that's why the most important next step we can take to undermine the group is, in fact, over the next 6 months or a year, to begin large-scale withdrawals of ground forces from Afghanistan and to continue the already significant withdrawals that are underway in Iraq. Because if we take today's major success and follow it up with undermining the long-term support for Al-Qaeda, what we will do is render that group increasingly fragile, increasingly a group that's falling apart, not a group that is reconstituting itself.
The presidential election this year will be decided on how Americans see the war on terror and how we think it should be fought. Joining us now from Los Angeles is Sam Harris, the author of the new book, The End of Faith, Religion, Terror, and the Future of Reason. So what's the most provocative thesis in this book?
Oh, well, the issue for me, Bill, with respect to the war on terror is that we really have a deal breaker with Islam, and we're not talking about it. It's due to political correctness that could well get many of us killed. We are not acknowledging that at the core of mainstream Islam, there's this belief in martyrdom and jihad, which no one is criticizing. You're not hearing moderate Muslims come out against this. And it really is a deal breaker because it and nothing else explains the kind of violence we see Muslims practicing. It explains why a guy can drive a car into a crowd of children, blow them up, blow himself up, and feel that this is a win for his cause.
Before our invasion of Iraq in March 2003, Iraq never experienced a suicide terrorist attack in its history. Never. Since then, suicide terrorism has been doubling every year. We've had 140,000 combat troops in the country, and I'm afraid it's right in line with expectations.
What about Afghanistan? This is nearly the opposite story. In Afghanistan, before 2001, there were again, when we toppled the Taliban, there were again 0 suicide attacks in that country during its whole history. They start in fall 2001. And then, for the first few years, there are actually only teeny tiny number of suicide attacks. And then 2006, up. Suddenly, there's a spike, and it stays high. Why? Why 2006? Well, first, the targets. Who's being struck? The green are U.S. and NATO troops. So suddenly, getting the far lion's share of the suicide attacks. Why suddenly are suicide attacks in such large numbers occurring against U.S. and NATO troops in 2006? Well, who's doing them? We can identify and corroborate the identity of 93 of the Afghan suicide attackers. 90% are Afghan nationals. A few percent are from the border regions. Only 5% are from outside the region of conflict. This is not some global jihad swirling around the world. This is local opposition to U.S. and Western military presence. But still, why 2006? Well, maybe it has something to do with ground forces. It does, but not simply. Here's the curve of us putting ground forces in the country. And first thing you'll notice in 2010, this is the Obama surge, is that we've actually been surging 20,000 troops, U.S. and Western troops into Afghanistan each of the last 4 years. Obama surge was just the last round of this. But why 2006? Because that's actually quite a steady slope. The key thing you need to know is in those early years when we only had a few thousand troops in the country, they were occupying Kabul, not spread around the country, basically defending Karzai, until October 2003, when the UN gave us a mandate to spread around the rest of the country And then, like a good military staff, ISAF developed a plan, and this is ISAF's actual plan. The map is ISAF's, for spreading our forces, we didn't call it an occupation, our forces around the rest of the country. First we went north, our friends, the Northern Alliance, then west, more friends, and then starting in 2006, the south and east. That's when the suicide attacks explode against our troops in the south. Those suicide attackers are not just Afghan nationals, they're Pashtuns from the south and the east. And, oh, by the way, 6 months later, we have an explosion of suicide terrorism in Pakistan, in the western regions of Pakistan, which are also Pashtun. Because while we're directly occupying the Pashtun homeland in Afghanistan, at the same time we put pressure on Musharraf to take 100,000 Pakistani army troops, move them from the eastern part of the country and put them on the western part of the country to essentially indirectly occupy the other half of the Pashtun homeland. And over 75% of all those hundreds of suicide attacks in Pakistan have been against the Pakistani army in western Pakistan, part of our indirect occupation of that part of the Pashtun homeland.
We are deluding ourselves with a lot of wishful thinking. I mean, we are desperate to believe that all of the problems in the world are of our own making. If we could just spread more money around and behave better on the global stage, people will treat us well, and that everyone wants the same thing, and it's all a matter of just more education, and this religion is intrinsically benign. It's just not true. And Osama bin Laden, the crucial, I've said this, but I think I should say it again, the real problem is that Osama bin Laden is giving a very plausible version of the faith. Now you can split a few hairs and say, well listen, apostates shouldn't be killed unless they speak kind of endlessly against the faith. But the penalty for apostasy is death under Islam. And there's no school of Islam which says, oh, no, we don't mind apostates. That just doesn't exist. There's no reformed Judaism version of Islam. That's a huge problem. It's a problem that has to be solved by Muslims, that we can't help them solve it by just lying to ourselves about the nature of their religion.
You know, I look at countries like the United Arab Emirates, for example.
Right.
Moderate country, helps America. No problems there. And I can't say that Islam is bad across the board.
Yeah, well, I'm not, to say that we're at war with Islam is quite distinct from saying that we're at war with all Muslims. But we have to realize we have a choice between conversation or war. We either have to win a war of ideas with the Muslim world, or we're going to fight some very terrible wars in the future. And we are not prosecuting this war of ideas. We're certainly not going to.
But how do you do that? I mean, if you look, nobody could deny that this war is being generated by Muslim fanatics. I call them Islama fascists. No one can
actually,
deny
people do deny that, though, Bill.
No.
You gotta understand that
nobody who we take seriously. Nobody who's clear thinking. Nobody we take seriously.
What over 95% of all suicide terrorist attacks around the world have in common is not religion, but a specific strategic objective: to compel a democratic state to withdraw combat forces. I don't mean advisors with sidearms. I mean tanks, fighter aircraft, and armor units from territory that terrorists consider to be their homeland or prize greatly. From Lebanon to the West Bank then, and as you will see, to Iraq and Afghanistan today, every suicide terrorist campaign has been waged by terrorist groups for this strategic objective. Very, very important. Now, to be clear, this does not account for every suicide attack. It does account for over 95% of all the suicide terrorism we've experienced around the world since 1980. This chart looks at the 9 disputes that comprise the 95% of the suicide attacks during this period. And if you let your eyes go up and down the middle, you'll see that territory, important to the terrorists, is central to each and every one of these campaigns. Let me again talk about Lebanon, the first one, because you're familiar with Hezbollah. Well, in June 1982, Hezbollah did not exist. In June 1982, Israel invaded southern Lebanon with 78,000 combat soldiers, 3,000 tanks and armored vehicles. 1 month later, Hezbollah was born. Then, over the course of the next year, and for reasons we're still not quite sure about, Hezbollah began to experiment with suicide attack. And the fourth suicide attack was against the U.S. Marines in Beirut in October 1983 that killed 241 of our Marines, the loss of one bomber. That's 10% of the force. 10% of the force. The same day, a Hezbollah suicide attacker struck the French troops, killing 58 French soldiers. Again, about 10% of the force. The loss of one bomber. Well, Ronald Reagan, no pacifist, just a few months later, decided to withdraw all American combat forces from Lebanon rather than face the risk of another suicide attack. And then the French left when we did, and Israel withdrew first in 1986 to a 6-mile security zone in the southern part of Lebanon, and then in May 2000, the Israeli army left Lebanon altogether. And what's significant about the withdrawals of those combat forces is that Hezbollah suicide attackers did not follow the Americans to New York, or the French to Paris, or even the Israelis to Tel Aviv. Do you know how many Hezbollah or any Lebanese suicide attacks have occurred since May 2000 when the Israeli army left southern Lebanon? 0. Not a single one. Not even during the summer of 2006, when you'll remember there was a 3-week air war between Hezbollah and Israel. Now think about that, ladies and gentlemen. If this is just about a bunch of Islamic radicals looking for any old excuse for a quick trip to heaven, we should have seen hundreds of Hezbollah suicide attackers in the summer of 2006, and we didn't get a single one. Now this is a pattern of the onset and ending of suicide attacks in Lebanon that cannot be accounted for by Islamic fundamentalism. After all, Hezbollah is still an Islamic fundamentalist group. And it fits to the month, foreign occupation. Foreign occupation.